we decided to stop at my favorite waterfall in southern Iceland, Seljalandsfoss. What makes this waterfall so unique is that you can actually walk all the way behind it.
We're behind another waterfall right now. It's freezing. We're soaking wet. It's crazy. We're trying to do this interview, but the beat camera with the 14 to 24 on it has so much water on it that I don't think we're even going to be able to make any detail out. It's actually, we've been wiping it down with a microfiber cloth, and it feels like we're just smearing the water around. I don't even think we can get this thing dry for the interview. It's really, really entertaining. I have crampons on my feet right now, so I'm rock solid. Patrick has one crampon on because he's lost the other one, so he's basically walking around in circles because he only has traction on his left foot or right foot. And Lee has no crampons on, so he's actually just sliding into position here. So this is a very difficult waterfall to photograph because it's like a whirlwind back here. There's water spray. We're getting some snow. It's really, really difficult. So what I've been doing is setting everything up, looking through this shower cap because it's hazy, but I can still frame my composition, get everything set, focused, ready to go. And then as soon as there's a little bit of a lull in this wind, I rip the cap off and I take my brackets. Now, we're also in a really dynamic lighting environment. We have the soft sunset behind, which is throwing a lot of light in the scene. So I have to shoot 5 exposure brackets to cover the complete dynamic range. It's basically a -2 for the sky and a +2 for the foreground and this cave element here. So in Photoshop, using post-processing, we're gonna take those 5 brackets, adjust them in Adobe Camera Raw, and then we're gonna put it all back together so it has a complete range of light. It may be difficult to work behind this waterfall, but honestly, it's one of my favorite places in Iceland. This was the first location that I ever visited on my first trip to Iceland a few years ago, and it's always been one of my favorite places to go. What's really cool about today, there's so much snow covering everything. There's ice, there's icicles falling from the cave above me. It's amazing. I've actually never seen it this way. We're very fortunate today because we got a massive snowstorm, and it also blew through and revealed this crystal blue sky behind us. So I'm really, really excited to get some different compositions here, bring it all into Photoshop, and really make some great shots. So another thing about shooting in these locations, you really shouldn't let the conditions prevent you from trying to get the shot. Using something as simple as a shower cap can prevent the accumulation of water on your lens. And you really want to explore and take advantage of this dynamic weather, because when you have these dynamic weather environments, it's really when you can come away with something extraordinary, something that you don't normally see. So these conditions might be really difficult to work with. Sometimes it feels very miserable. You're freezing back here. But when that light comes through and everything lines up like this, it's really something to work for. So another thing that really pays off is having weatherproof gear. So everything that I'm wearing right here is waterproof. These glove liners aren't, but I can put my gloves over this so that I stay dry when I'm working. This is a carbon fiber Really Right Stuff tripod. It does not get hurt by weather, rain, even salt water. Everything does not deteriorate this as long as you take care of it. My cameras, both my Nikon D810, my Fuji X-T1, they are water and weather sealed, so they're made to work in these kind of environments. Most of the lenses that I have, including the one that I'm shooting this today, is also weather resistant. So while I'm out here, it really doesn't matter that water drops are just streaming off of my camera and there's a little bit of ice forming on my tripod. I feel confident that with that weather sealing, I don't really have to worry about equipment damage. I can just focus on getting the shots that I want.
Truth be told, the conditions made this vantage point impossible to work with. But thankfully, while the cameras weren't rolling, I was able to walk around and get some different shots from different perspectives.
So as you can see, Iceland is full of amazing waterfalls. This one is one of my absolute favorites. I've shot here probably a dozen times and I never get tired of it. So I've shot a few different shots, a few different compositions, both horizontal and vertical. I can't wait to get into Lightroom to see which ones I like the most.
Hey everyone, welcome to Lesson 8, Seljalandsfoss Waterfall. From the video, you remember this is the waterfall we walked all the way behind. It's actually one of my very favorite waterfalls in Iceland. It was the first waterfall I actually photographed in Iceland on my very first trip years ago. Ever since then, I like to go back here and try to get different compositions, unique angles, and just overall different things that I think I didn't see before. I'm not going to lie, this was a really difficult one to photograph. You can see from the video that it was just a wet, icy death trap back there. So truth be told, I didn't really end up with anything good from behind the waterfall because of all the spray, but I was able to get something pretty nice by climbing up. So if you visit this waterfall yourself and you walk into the waterfall, if you hook around to the left, you'll go behind the waterfall, but there's a path that takes you up on the right, and you can actually climb all the way on top of the mountain. Since I had both of my crampons, Lee and Patrick were kind of sliding around all over the place, I climbed to the top and I caught the last fading light of the waterfall. So it's pretty nice, but it does have some issues. The main issue is the lighting was so soft and so dim, I ended up with really nice pink clouds, but not much light coming in through the waterfall. So it's a really beautiful shot. There's some nice mixed ice, mixed snow, some yellows and some greens, but it's taking a little bit to sort of nurture them back into existence. So this one's probably going to be the most complex file that we worked on so far. We're going to have to apply some of the same masking stuff that we've learned and learn some new masking stuff to be able to get this to be seamless. We're going to have to blend in soft water. And once everything's taken care of, we're actually going to go in and we're going to paint in some color. Now, we're not going to add color where color doesn't exist, but we're going to find those yellows, those oranges, and those greens, and we're going to paint in some additional percentages of that color to create more color and color separation. So let's go ahead and get started. So inside of Lightroom here, I've brought in 3 files for you guys to look at. So let me go ahead and scroll up to the settings here. Now there are 3. This is the normal exposure that I shot at f8 and 16 millimeter, a low ISO 31. And here's a -1 exposure for the sky. So the first thing we're going to do is combine these two together, multiple exposures, to get a balanced exposure because the sky was very, very hot when I was shooting. I shot another exposure after that at f22, and you can see that at f22, it's half a second. And the difference between the f8 exposure and the f22 exposure is this really nice soft water. Throughout this series, you guys know that when you shoot at f22, we have a lot of water spots and a lot of sensor dust to get rid of. So I shot at f8, so I have a really clean one to work with, and again at f22, so I have the water to blend in later. So let's go ahead and balance these first. The first thing that I want to do is create my base. Now my base is going to be working with the shadows. So we're going to work with the shadows first, then after we get the shadows intact, we're going to get the highlights, and then we're going to put it together. So this one really, it's kind of flat and dull, unfortunately. It can be a very vivid scene, but we lost some of that detail just because of the soft light. So what I'm going to do is just go ahead and adjust it a little bit. I'm going to pull the shadows up a little bit. I may actually, in this case, add just a hair of contrast, just so I don't lose too much of that contrast. And you can see that this is pretty balanced already. I'm also going to pull the highlights down in the sky, and you can see that that sky will start to come back a little bit. But if I pull them down all the way, you notice that we're already starting to get some of that gray effect. So there's so much light in this scene, and it's funny because it's not very apparent. Some of these scenes, usually you can see just hot light coming in, but even this soft light, sometimes a single exposure isn't enough. So I'm just going to pull that down a little bit, and I'll probably boost the exposure just a tiny little bit, and I'm not going to use my stylus, I'm just going to say 0.2 there just to bring it globally up. That's perfect. So here's the first one, this is the shadow exposure. Let's go over to the one for the highlights here. Now remember, when we're blending multiple exposures, we don't want to just blend them as is. We want to try to match them so that any overlap in the masking will be seamless. So in this case, the shadows are too dark, where my base exposure, they're a little bit lighter. So I'm going to do the same thing here. The highlights look pretty good, so I'm going to pull the shadows up instead. And I'm going to bring those shadows up, compensate a little bit with the exposure, and then I'm going to pull the highlights down, just so I can get all that detail back in the sky where I want it. And again, it's going to look a little bit different. It's pretty flat so far, but basically I just want to create a nice blending point. And I'll go ahead and pull the shadows up just a little bit more. And just to mirror and reflect what I did before, I'll add a hair of contrast into the scene. Something else that I might want to do just to help me pull the color back is add about 20% vibrant. So I'll go ahead and punch in 20 there. I'll do the same thing here at 20. Good. Okay, so now it's time to bring these into Photoshop. I'm just going to do one last double check here. May even want to pull the highlights down just a little bit more. I know that's a lot to pull the highlights down, but they're very, very bright right now. So I'll go ahead and just make my final adjustments, and now I'm going to take the base layer, the shadows layer, and I'm going to say export, make sure my settings are intact today, PSD, ProPhoto, in this case 8 bits, just like we've been working. I'm going to choose my temp directory where I keep all of my files, open in Photoshop CC, and export. So here we have the one exposure in Photoshop. Let's go back to Lightroom, and I'm just going to send in the second one. Again, can make sort of a double check everything, make sure it's fine before I do it. And this time, export with previous to get it into Photoshop. Next thing I need to do is go ahead and bring this into the other document. You guys remember how to do that with the hotkeys, and I'm going to paste it in, and you can see that now I have those darker highlights. So I have my shadow layer here, and I have my highlights layer here. So there's a couple ways that we can proceed now. Remember in the last lesson we did a sky replacement, and I was able to just use a color range to select the blue. And that was because the blue was so predominant, and it was a nice natural cutout point with the sky. In this case it's a little bit different because I have these soft pink clouds and these blue hues. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce something that we haven't used before, and that's a simple luminosity mask. So let's examine exactly what a luminosity mask is and how to apply it. So the first thing that I want to do is explain how luminosity works in this image. We did talk a little bit about RGB color space before. RGB is additive color, which is very interesting. Equal parts of red, green, and blue together, 100% red, green, and blue will equal white. 50% red, green, and blue together will be 50% gray. Any variation of those colors is when you're going to start to get color instead of just white. So basically all of your colors in your channels menu just represent how much value per pixel is there in each of the in all of the tonal range. So it's really easy actually. If you look at red, you can see that black means there's basically no red, and then white means that there's a lot of red basically, or 100% red. So each one of these channels actually add up together to create your RGB, which is your colors. Well, the cool thing is you guys know how masks work. This whole time we've been painting on masks. Black is invisible, white is visible, and we've been able to use gradients and any percentages in between of gray to have partial reveals on masks. So we can paint it on, paint it off. Well, the cool thing is any of these channels can also be loaded and used as a mask. In fact, if I hold the Command key, I can load these channels as a selection. So that's a selection of the red, that's a selection of the green, and a selection of the blue. So that's actually really useful. And here's where it comes into play. If I look at the channels here, let's say the whole RGB channel, and I load the RGB, and you can see that little square comes up, and I click it, or Command click it, it's going to load it as a selection. If I go down here to the Make New Mask, or Make New Channel here, it's actually going to create an alpha channel for me that represents all of the luminosity for the entire image. So effectively what I've done here, by selecting RGB, by command clicking it, turning it into a selection, and making a new alpha channel, I've selected the luminance of the image. And right now, since white is selected, black is not selected, I've created a mask for the highlights. Now check this out. If I do a Command I, which is an invert, it's going to invert the mask, and now I've selected the shadows. And you can see all those dark areas of the image are now selected, where the highlights here are now not selected. So if I turn invert again, Command I, you can see now it's the highlights again and not the shadows. Well, this is really useful because if we go back to the image itself, we take a look at our layers here, I really want to replace the highlights of the image with the highlights here. So I basically want everything in the background, most of the image, and this layer underneath in my background, and then I want the highlights to be replaced with this layer. So what we're going to do is actually use what we just created as a mask. So I'm going to load what I just created as a mask again, Command click. I'm going to go to Layers, but instead of applying it to this layer, I'm going to create a new folder, and I'm going to say Make New Mask, and now that mask, that luminosity mask, is going to be controlling this folder. And it's really cool. So now I can put my sky layer inside of this folder, turn it on, and now it'll only exist inside of that mask. Since that mask only selects the highlights, this layer exists in the highlights of the image. So it's actually really cool. So congratulations, you've created your first luminosity mask. Luminosity masking may seem difficult at first, but it's actually, it's very, simple. There's no reason to overcomplicate it. It's simply a selection of the luminance of either a channel or your entire image. And everything's pretty much broken down into black and white anyway, and anything that's black and white can be used as a mask. And when we're trying to blend exposures, we're usually correcting either the highlights or the shadows, so it's easy to use the luminosity, the natural luminosity of the image, as a mask to repair the highlights or the shadows. In this case, I started with the shadows to repair the highlights, but I could have started with the highlights and then done an inverted luminosity mask for the shadows. This will start to make sense the more we use it, but since this is the first time, we'll just go ahead and leave it as is. We won't make any modifications to the luminosity mask. Now, the reason that I put it on the folder is this. I want to have a luminosity mask control everything that's in this folder. It also gives me an extra layer of masking ability, meaning that I can add a new mask to the layer with the highlights on it. So I'm going to create a new mask, and now I'm really only concerned about the sky, so I can start to mask out areas that I don't want the highlights from this layer to include. So if I turn it on and off, you can see that I'm getting the sky just like how I want it. It's putting the sky back in, making it look pretty nice, but it's also dimming this snow layer here. So what I'm going to do is use the gradient tool, and I'm going to mask out a portion. So I'm going to say this is going to exist, the sky is going to exist here, but then it's going to mask out to about there. So that looks pretty good. So now this layer exists inside of the luminosity mask, but only exists inside of this other mask that I've created. Now I can just grab the brush tool really fast, and I can paint black, and I can just paint out the areas. Now remember that I spent a little bit of time inside Adobe Lightroom to make sure that my masks, or sorry, not my masks, my levels that I set in Adobe Camera Raw were similar, so that when I masked this together, any overlap wouldn't really create any issues, since I'm basically blending one layer on top of itself. And by making sure that those levels were similar in the highlights and the shadows, then it makes my job here masking much, much easier. And I can go ahead and hold the Option key, click on this mask, and I can just see if I forgot any areas, and that looks pretty good. So it's a soft, easy mask, and I was able to replace the sky. So that just puts those values back in exactly where I want them. So let's leave this as is. We'll head back to Lightroom, and let's start balancing the water file. So the water is going to go in right on top, and that's going to be a really easy mask. Before I do that, I have to just make sure that I mirror my adjustments. These files look a little bit different, but basically I just want to make sure that if I toggle between the two, they're pretty close. And actually they are pretty close. With this one here, I added a little bit of contrast, so I'm going to add a little bit of contrast to this one, and I'll probably pull the shadows just a hair, just a tiny little bit, just to make sure that, again, it masks in seamlessly. Now this is nice because when I export this, say export with previous, it should line up right on top. We can use the soft water and not have any of the negative effects of F22. So here it is here. Command A, select all, Command C, copy, Command W, close, and I'll select the top layer here and paste it in. And it accidentally went into the folder, so I'll make sure it's on top. And you can see here before and after. So I'm going to hold the Option key, click on the new mask, and that's going to create a black mask. I'm going to select the brush again, select white, make sure that I'm painting 100%, and now I'm just going to paint that soft waterfall in. That's all I'm concerned about, just the soft waterfall and the mist. I'll go ahead and zoom in a little bit here. And here's where I can start painting small percentages. So I'm going to take the opacity down, the flow down a little bit, and I'm just going to paint the soft waterfall right in. It's actually pretty simple, and it's nice. So now we've created our 3-level composite again, one for the base of the shadows, the highlights, and the soft water. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. So we have the before and we have the after. So all that work just to repair the image and get it back to the way it was when we were there and we were looking at it in person. With the blend starting to take shape, with everything put back together the way it is, now it's time to start taking some artistic license on this image. Remember a few lessons ago, I taught you guys how to do Patrick removal. Now it's time to learn how to do Lee removal. So check this out. I'm going to zoom right in here, and you can see there's Lee. He was doing some Steadicam drone stuff. You can see the Phantom 2. He's got the camera on his back and the remote. So that's a no-no in landscape photography. Lee should not be existing with a helicopter in this scene. So the first thing we're going to do is the fun part, which is zap him out of existence. So we'll go ahead and use the clone stamp again. I'm going to set my brush size, and I'm probably going to do something about a flow of 20. And this is going to be easy. You can see this is already pretty dull. We haven't done anything to bump the contrast yet. So basically anything goes here. It's just this rough green patchy earth. So you can really just find any line. Like, see where this black line meets this green line? I'm just going to pick an area right around here where that meets, and then I'm going to find an area where it should meet again, and I'm just going to start painting him out. Painting Lee out. So he's almost gone. And this is what's cool about this stuff. I mean, this ground, it looks so unnatural anyway, even these sand dunes. If you start to paint over it, it's really not going to matter. Nobody's going to know what was supposed to be here or what wasn't supposed to be here. So you have a lot of freedom to just sort of paint. And if you use a light brush, maybe 10% flow, you can just start to add a little bit of texture and color over top of this image. So it makes it really easy to get rid of. Now, after Lee's gone, so that looks pretty good, we can just go ahead and take a look at the things that distract us about this image. First thing that comes right to my attention is this guy right here. That's actually a light that's turning on. There are illuminated walkways for this waterfall, so again, that just kind of takes the people right out of the reality of the scene. I just don't like to have cars or lights. People are fine sometimes, but this stuff that just looks unnatural, it's easy to just go ahead and get rid of it. Now that those things are gone, let's take a look again. Another thing that I really don't like are these sticks that are sticking up here. I think that they're very distracting. I love the texture here. I love the ice and the grass, but I just don't like these things. So again, I'm just going to pick the brush, maybe a 20%. I'm going to use my stylus to change the size of the brush a little bit. And again, this is where it's really fun. Nobody knows what all this stuff is. It's such a mass, a tangle of different textures that pretty much anything goes. As long as you don't paint something that's larger, so closer to the camera, be a bigger perspective. You can't paint bigger objects over smaller perspective objects, but for the most part, you have artistic license to create whatever you want here. So this is probably the easiest cloning that we'll do. Stuff like this, for example, where you have grass and different things and edges, it's always good to find an edge somewhere, like maybe an edge of the grass here that I can replace this grass with, and basically just go up from there. It's pretty simple stuff, and again, we can just do a little bit of cleanup. Now, you know that you're doing it, nobody else will know that you're doing it, so as long as it looks seamless, you can pretty much get away with murder here, kind of like we took Lee right out of existence. In fact, this can be therapeutic. I've often said that cloning can be therapeutic because you get to remove things and people from existence. So if a lot of people got in your way, this should feel good getting your revenge. I'm just going to get rid of a couple more of these things. Again, this really just depends on what you want to do. And I always like my scenes to look serene and empty of people, and I just don't know what these sticks are really. Again, this stuff, this is all just completely up to you guys, how much you take out, what you add in. Pay particular attention to things that are closer to the camera, things that might go noticed, but really with this stuff, infinite detail. You could clear out some of these black spots here, some of the other twigs, some of the branches, and really the goal for me here is to just sort of remove a little bit of the human element. So even these posts around here, we could go in and maybe remove these posts. And this is a really good job for the clone stamp. The content aware doesn't seem to really do the job too well. And I'm just going to kind of bounce back and forth between different areas here. So for something like this, you can even use a smaller brush. And you can basically just start drawing a little bit around here. It's pretty easy. Again, this is so minor. It's imprint anyway. Even if I zoomed all the way out, chances are at 36 megapixel, nobody would even see this. But I know it's there, and I'd hate for somebody to purchase this image from me and get it blown up wall size or even billboard size and just say, man, I really wish you would have gotten rid of those posts. And that does happen every once in a while, where people ask specifically to remove the human element. And every year in Iceland, more things sort of go up. And again, this actually, for safety reasons, a lot of this stuff actually exists. So it's not just there to show people where to go. It's actually there to keep them safe. And in this situation, it was very, very icy back there. So it was good that these posts were there, to be honest. Not so much for me because I had the crampons, but for Lee and Patrick, they definitely were thankful. So again, I'm not going to spend the time with it, but if you guys want to work on this image a little bit more, I encourage you to try to remove this staircase, because that's really the last thing that has a visual imprint that takes you out of the natural landscape. This little bridge is a nice element, these little houses, everything back there, everything's infinite. You can see way down here, there's a bench, those kind of things you can get rid of, but for the most part it's going to be up to you. I think that's pretty good for this demonstration. So with that, next step is to make any final adjustments to the blend. In this case, I think it's pretty good, but if we wanted to adjust the mask on the waterfall mask looks pretty good. The luminosity mask here looks pretty good. And I just want to show you guys, you can always turn on and off a mask by holding Shift. And if I Shift click any mask, it'll actually put a red X through it. It doesn't delete it, but it just disables it. So if you click Shift again, it'll show you. So it'll always show you what something will look like with or without a mask. And right off the bat, you guys see that right now, if this layer didn't have this luminosity mask on it and I turned it off, you can see that I still have a lot more detail to pull back in the sky. So here's where I want to show you guys the next trick, and that's actually clamping levels in a luminosity mask. Well, let's take a look at this luminosity mask here. So we have some things that are white and some things that are black, but it's basically just a luminance representation of our entire image. But this could be color corrected as well. So really what I want to do is I want to have more of the sky be white, and I want more of this area to be black. So if I were to do curves, just regular curves, now we cannot use an adjustment layer on a mask, but we can load curves, and that's under Image, Adjustment, Curves, or Command M on the keyboard. And if I load curves, I can actually clamp these levels. And what I mean by clamping, or crushing is another way that people say it, if I move the highlights to the left, that's going to intensify the highlights, and it's going to start to clamp. Notice these areas that get eaten up in white, so it's clamping these values. Same thing if I do the blacks here, it's going to go ahead and crush or clamp those blacks. So I can change the severity and the intensity of this mask just by clamping the values a little bit. So let's see what happens if I do that. We pull the whites out a little bit, and I'll go ahead and pull the blacks out just a little bit, just like that, just to clamp it and give it a little bit more intensity. And I'll go ahead and take a look at the result here and hide the quick mask here. And now I get even more of that sky, but you can see I'm starting to pull in more of the dullness of the background, but that's okay. Now I'm going to go in here and I'm just going to go ahead and paint in with the brush, a very, very light brush of white here. So flow of maybe 10%, and I'm actually just going to clean up some of this white. I just want the white, more area of the sky here to be intense, just to pick that up because there's some extra luminance. Again, it doesn't have to be perfect, but what it's going to do is it's going to cause the sky to be even more intense. So now I just have some areas that I may need to clean up, maybe here, so we'll go ahead and clean those up as well. And again, this will just take a little bit of time to clean. But for the most part, I just want to soften up that transition. And I think that looks pretty good. Now that the blend is complete, let's go ahead and put everything into a folder. And to do that, I have to just turn this off of being a background into a normal layer, select everything, drag it to a folder. Remember that hotkey for make a copy of everything, Shift, Option, Command, E. So it makes kind of like a gymnastic move for your fingers. And the next step is just go ahead and add some of the contrast back in that we're missing here before we start doing our own color correction. And to do that really quickly, I'm just going to add some Pro contrast just to kind of pump those values a little bit more. So we'll go ahead and say Color Effects Pro 4. Maximize the screen so we can see it here. Okay, now in Color Effects Pro, let's go ahead and use Pro Contrast. So the first thing, again, dynamic contrast is going to pop the values out a little bit. We have to take special care of the sky just to make sure that we don't blow out any of those values that we spent so much time getting back. So we'll just go ahead and add some more contrast here. And this is really interesting. I just want to show you guys a good way to protect the highlights. Let's say I turn this way up and I start to destroy or eat up some of the highlights in the sky. And you can see it reflected on the histogram to the right. If that happens, but I still, for some reason, in this case, it's not a great example because I wouldn't want it to look like this, but if I wanted this effect in the shadows, I could actually clip the highlight. So similar to how we just clamp the levels in Photoshop using curves, we can do the same kind of thing and we can restrict, and you can see as I start to do this, it'll protect the highlights. So you can see that area of highlights here. Pay special attention to that. As I clip these highlights, we can actually clip it away from the control area here. So it will not, it'll protect them, it'll force protection of the highlights. So that's really useful. And what it's going to allow me to do is add extra contrast in to where I like it, add extra dynamic contrast to really pump these values up a little bit in this image while protecting those highlights so that I make sure that I don't blow anything out. So that's a really powerful feature. You can do the same thing in the shadows, but be careful if you do too much, then it's going to start to make your image look really washed out like it was before. So the idea is to add contrast but not destroy it. One last thing that we'll see if correct color range brings any life into this image, and it brings some yellow into the image. It really doesn't do much, but a little bit may just neutralize some of the overall color cast, and that looks pretty good. Now we're going to add one more filter. We're actually going to add a contrast color range. Now unfortunately with this particular image, it's really beautiful. It's a nice location, but the lighting was really soft. Even though we have the pink clouds, the light was so diffuse that it's not really adding much intensity here. So what I'm trying to do is just give myself a palette to work with. And I can't really fix all the color using color effects, but what I can do is change the tonality in here and add some variation. So if I say add color contrast here, I can start to add color contrast. Now, we'll forget about the sky. I'm not really concerned about the sky right now. I'm just concerned about this area here, and that's going to give me the ability to start popping some of these colors. And they don't pop because of the color value, but they start to separate. So you can see that color separation just starting to happen in specific areas, and it's going to be subtle. But what I'm going to do is go ahead and remove this effect from the sky. So I'm going to create a couple negative viewpoints here just to make sure that I am not affecting the sky at all. I want to keep the soft, subtle look that the sky has, but I only want to kick up the intensity of the other areas here. So let's just double check these control points by going to the mask mode here, and you can see that I almost got them all. Let me just go ahead and get rid of this cloud here as well, and that's good here. Perfect. That looks good. Actually, that's exactly what I want. So we'll go ahead and apply this by clicking OK. Now that there's some more micro contrast in the image, we've done that just by adding a little bit of Color Effects Pro just to pop the values, separate them a little bit. Now that there is more separation, it's time to surgically go in and fix the color by creating more color separation. We're going to do that with a combination of masks and adjustment layers. Before we get started with the adjustment layers and the color correction surgery, as I'm going to call it, let's just toggle this on and off and let's see if we like what happened here. We have to make sure that we really like the way that it looks, if we like all that rich contrast that we added. And in this case, I'm going to go ahead and leave it as is. Remember, I can always change the opacity. But since I'm dealing with color right now, the contrast I'm only using as a backdrop. So here's the first thing that I'm going to do. Let's start a little bit complicated. Let's do it with curves first. So the first thing that I want to do is see all these little areas of contrast. These are beautiful browns, yellows, greenish browns here in the moss, and then we actually have some green grass that's getting sort of eaten away by the winter. But this all stays pretty nice, and believe it or not, this moss grows in the wintertime in Iceland, and this waterfall is kind of nice. So what I want to do, my vision here, is to be able to bring all these colors back, these warm tones and green tones, and have them complement the whites, pinks, and the blues. In a similar fashion, there's some green down here that we'll have to work on too. So the first thing I want to do is rebuild the warm tones, and we can do that with a couple different tools. But just to get you guys used to it, let's start using curves. Well, curves is really fun, and I know it's a little intimidating at first because it's basically just a curved graph. Just like we clamp the levels, again, this will make everything brighter because we're actually clamping the highlights. This will make everything darker. You can add your own custom brightness and contrast just by changing the levels here. If you need to get rid of any points, you can just drag them off here. So in this case, if I do everything in RGB, remember it's RGB color, we're going to add luminance, subtract luminance from the shadows, midtones, and highlights. But what if I select an individual channel? In this case, let's start with red. What happens if I start to move the red over a little bit? Now, see, we're getting red tone in the entire image. Well, that looks pretty good, but let's add something else. Now let's go into the greens. And what I'm actually going to do is start mixing colors together. So by mixing colors, I can actually start to get different shades and different tones. And using the different combination of these tones, I can actually start to get warm or cool tones depending on how I want this to work. So again, I'm basically just adjusting the shadows, basically shadows and highlights in the blues, and adjusting the red until I get a warm color that I like here. And I think that looks pretty good. I'm just going to adjust the greens a little bit. And again, I'm just mixing color here, just mixing color. And if you think about adding two colors together, if you've ever taken a color theory class, that's exactly how this works. So it's basically pushing and pulling tones together just like you'd mix paint on a palette to be able to change things from here to here. So I'm going to go ahead and put this palette back in here where it goes, and I'm going to black out this mask. Now I've made it a little more intense than I planned on the final being, just so that I can show you guys display purposes here. I like to make it a little bit more intense than I actually want it. Reason being is I'm able to go ahead and paint it in selectively. So now we can zoom in on this area here, and this is where the stylus and the Wacom Intuos tablet comes in really handy, because with the brush tool and a very low flow amount, I can go ahead and start painting in these areas of warmth. So I can start to bring back some of the tonality in this image. And it's really nice. So we'll just start to paint some of this stuff in. Remember, we have these nice greens, these nice reds, and different things like that. So this basically is just what I call creating color separation. So I'm working very hard to try to find the areas here. Like, see all these red tones in here? I'm just really working hard to try to find these areas that already exist and these color variations inside of these areas here so that I can go ahead and warm them up. And this is using curves. So the first one that I'm going to do is just going to follow some of the natural rock formation and really try to bring those those values back. I've pointed this out a lot in this particular tutorial, but this is all part of the artistic process. And if you really like an image, these are the kind of things that you can start to think about. Now, I can also change the greens here, but we're going to use a different layer. We're going to use one more curves layer here. And I'm going to say, here we go, add a new curves. And this time I'm really going to focus on just the greens, specifically these green tones. And again, I'm just going to kind of create this really greenish look here. And I can offset that green by adding a little bit of red back in. And if I add the red back in, it's going to make it a little bit more yellow. So I just want to take the intensity of the green down a little bit. If I add blue, you can see that it removes the green altogether. But if I remove the blue, you can see that it even enhances the yellow just a little bit. So before and after, now I'm getting some of the green. Again, this takes a little bit of vision and a little bit of patience, because now we're going to go ahead and paint this in very lightly here. And we're going to start painting these greens back. Oh, this is really fun for me. I like this kind of work, and I get a lot of questions, a lot of emails all the time asking me how I get my colors to be so specific. Well, this is one of the ways. Color can be manipulated on a canvas, on a digital canvas in a digital photo, just like it can on a painter's canvas as well. But the benefit here is I can undo, I can change opacity, and I don't have to get paint all over myself when I'm done, which I'm really bad about when I do any kind of oil painting. So again, remember this is green, so now I can start to bring all these greens out. Nice thing is too, I'm not cloning anything, I'm not adding anything in, I'm just adding color. Color is color. It's just shifting it around. We can add it, make it more intense, and it's actually really, really easy to work with. So let's go back to, oh, maybe, you know what, let's add a little bit of green in here too. I'll sort of bring some of that out. Notice all this grass down here. If I start to add green into this, it'll bring it a little bit back to life. Again, I don't want it to be too intense. This is sort of a push and a pull and a balancing act, because this is where it gets really precise. And if you love color as much as I do, then the more you work with color, the more subtle your corrections are going to be. You'll notice that sometimes 5% color increase is all it takes to give the eye extra separation and extra pull. So let's go ahead and get a little bit closer to the water here. And that looks pretty good. So here's some other things that we can do. So these are using curved layers, and if we just do a quick before and after now, you can see that I have color, and then I've added some more color back in with the greens. What I probably want to do with the greens here is sort of diffuse it a little bit, just sort of where I follow those lines. Those lines are a little too rough. What I'm going to do now is we've used curves, so now you can see how you can mix color with curves. Let's use another filter that's really useful. And a lot of people don't think to use this, but you can also use what's called a photo filter. Photo filter, if you're just starting out, if you don't really want to use curves, photo filter is nice because it puts an overall filter on the image. So I've just picked warm, and you can see that I can add a warming filter. If I turn it up, you can see that that gets more intense. So the cool thing is I can even pick something like, let's say, magenta or red. And I can say red, and I can turn this way down. And there's a couple different options here after I pick the color, and that's preserve luminosity. So you notice if I turn this on and off right now, you can see that everything gets a little bit brighter. If I take this off, what it's going to do is just try to change the color without affecting the luminosity. So this can give you two different effects. So luminosity, preserve luminosity on would be really good for the highlights. What I want to try to do is see these little areas of red. I just want some extra push on these reds, and I'm just going to change it here. And this is an overlay effect, so it's really nice. The same thing I can do, I can black this out again, and then very lightly I can go in, and now I can start to add some of my red tones back in here. So this is going to be the warm parts of the rock. Believe it or not, there's actually quite a few. So here's warm tones sort of act as browns. In here, maybe some warmer tones as browns. And again, just an artistic process of bringing these values back into life and just getting them all back. Let's do one more photo filter, just a regular photo filter again. This time I'm going to use a warming filter. The warming filter 81 is pretty nice, and I'm going to leave preserve luminosity on. Or actually, you know what? Let's take it off. That looks a little bit better. And I'm going to black this mask out again here, and just like before, I'm going to paint. So let's go ahead and bring even more life into this. This is kind of cool. We do this with layers, do it selectively, and we do it with paint. And we're able to bring back some of the values. I wanted to use this warming layer specifically for this area here as well. So I want to go ahead and bring these values back to life. And this is just because it's a hazy day, it was snowy out, there was a lot of stuff going on here. I added greens here, but I can also warm this up a little bit and just add a little bit more life to this area of snow. That snow looks so beautiful too. Let's add a little bit more warmth here. There we go. We'll call this Color Surgery 101. I don't think I would have ever made it as a medical doctor, but I can certainly surgically enhance color. I'll hide this here, and I just want to show you guys a quick before and after. So we've started to add some of that color back in. And now it's just a matter of cleaning it up, adding color where you want it, taking it away where you don't want it. And it's also good to start naming these things too. I know that I started with a red, then a green, then another red, and a warmth. But if you name them, then you'll know when you go back. Another thing that you can do is you can create folders for these, and you can name them things so you know what they are later on. In this case here, I'll say Color Surgery. Now that we've talked about selective color adjustments, let's do a couple global things before we move on to the next step. So these are local adjustments, just a few basic things. Now I'm going to add some global adjustments. And really what I want to do is bring the brightness of this area out a little bit while maintaining the contrast in the sky. So I'm going to use another curves layer here. We'll say curves, and I'm going to increase the area of contrast that I want in this area, and I'm actually just going to protect my shadows. And if I click on one of these dots here and use the arrow keys, you can see that I can nudge them. So really by leaving this here in the shadows, I protect this area of shadows while you can see enhancing the highlight. So it's going to add some more micro contrast in the foreground. And as I start to move this up, you can see that it's going to add brightness in those shadows. So I can find a good amount to use, hide this, and again, what I'm going to do this time is I'm just going to paint it in selectively. I can use gradients or I can just use paint, and I'm going to go ahead and use maybe a 30% flow here, and I'm just going to paint this area in where I want it. I don't want to use it probably down here too, just a little bit more brightness, just to add some more variance and tone here. And that looks pretty good. Down here in the corner. And if you're ever wondering if you're blowing out some of the values, if you load this again, it'll show you what's inside of the mask. And you can see that area right there where this spike ends is the extent of my highlights. So now, theoretically, with this mask, if I were to bring this over, that's going to be now touching white. So if I go further, you can see that I'm going to start blowing out some of the white values. So that's a good indication of your mask area, and I'm just trying to get full tonality from black to white inside of this mask. Let's also add some of the contrast back in. Well, brightness and contrast is actually a great tool. We can just add some global contrast back into the whole image, maybe somewhere between 15 and 20. We can also add a vibrance layer. Vibrance is actually pretty useful. You turn it up too much and it just looks horrible. But if you do turn it up, pay attention to what it's actually doing. It's not a global thing like saturation just saturates all the values. What vibrance does is it creates microsaturation. So it's going to find areas that are different. It's going to find blues that you didn't think existed, greens, yellows, and it's going to bring them out separately. And it's going to try to do it in an intelligent way. And it's usually intelligent right around, I'd say, 20% is usually acceptable, 18 to 20%. So we've created just our sort of global fix layers here. We've brought back some of this intensity, and we also have the curves to bring everything out. And again, here in the curves, I may even want to bring this up, this dot that I was working on here in the shadows. I may want to just go ahead and raise this whole area up a little bit just to add a little bit more brightness and variation here. Same thing here. I'm just going to say, call this something else. We'll just call this global color. Contrast. And we'll move on to the next step. Spent so much time now working on the foreground elements and the colors, I've neglected to color correct the sky. So let's go ahead and do that right now. Remember that luminosity mask that I created before? Let's use the same technique to just do a correction for the sky. Let's go back into the channels. And remember, I've already created that alpha channel. I'm going to go ahead and Command click it. I'm going to go to layers, and I'm going to create another curves layer with that mask applied. So anytime I create any new adjustment layer with a selection enabled with the crawling ants on the screen, you'll see that it'll apply it as a mask. So again, with this, it's kind of nice. Like I could brighten just the sky areas, just the highlights. Right now I'm focusing on the highlights. But in this case, I actually want to bring the sky values down a little bit. And you can see that I'm adding more contrast in that sky just by bringing those tones down. You've also noticed that while I've done that, while I've been able to change the tonality of the sky, I've also changed the tonality of the foreground. So what I'm going to do is use the gradient tool to change this mask. Now this is kind of cool. So far, right now, if I were to select using the gradient tool and I were to paint a gradient on this mask, you can see that it's just going to replace the mask. That's not what I want. I can actually change the mode to multiply. And with multiply enabled, I can actually add. If I add this to it, it'll actually just paint black over the mask. So it'll multiply it right over top, and you can see that effect happening right now. So that's really useful. I'm going to turn the mode back to normal, just so I don't forget to do that later. It happens all the time if I don't reset the tools before I go on to the next thing. And here, I'm actually going to do the same thing I was doing before, and I'm just going to simply brush out this other area. And this should be really easy, really straightforward at this point. We've been using this brush tool a lot. And it creates a seamless, again, it's just a color correction. It's pretty simple. I'll go ahead and look at this, make sure there's nothing that I missed here. That all looks pretty good. We'll just follow that edge really nicely. So I've created this sort of custom curves just for the sky, just for that area, just to change the contrast a little bit. And you know what? I'm going to adjust it slightly. This all still needs a little bit of tweaking before it's final. I feel like it's about 90%. Need to paint a little bit more color in, change this. Maybe this Color Effects Pro layer was a little bit too intense. You might want to bring it down just a little bit, just so that the contrast isn't quite as heavy. But the next thing that I really want to do is talk about sharpening. So prior to this, we've only been really using a high-pass filter, which we're going to go ahead and use here. So I'll go ahead and duplicate this layer, create a high-pass filter just like we've been doing before, and I'm going to leave this here at 3, set it to overlay. And this is not crucial, but basically what I want to do is just paint out anything that's water. So in this case, we'll go ahead and make the brush a little bit smaller, paint out the water here, all of this water, part of the river, and then actually just the sky. So right now it looks like I'm painting on nothing. If I enable the quick mask with # key and swap the brush again, you can see that I can go ahead and paint all of this out. You can do this with a selection. You could even do this with a luminosity mask. as well. Whatever you think is the easiest way. For me, I just like to paint. It's actually faster with the stylus. So we have the one sharpening layer here. Well, let's take particular interest in the foreground, and let's see that our sharpening layer should be popping out a lot of that grass. And it is. It's actually starting to bring it right back into the realm of something that should be crisp and sharp. But what if we want to take it a step further? Do we create an additional high-pass filter? We could, but then it starts to look a little bit weird. You get these little halos around edges and different things. So instead, what we're going to do now is I'm going to introduce a new filter, and that's Nik Sharpener Pro. So up here under Filter, Nik Collection, I'm going to go to Sharpener Pro. There's two types. We're going to use the output sharpener. It actually has a raw sharpener that you can do as a pre-process from Lightroom before you go into Photoshop. I like to do it when I'm in the PSD mode. Let's go ahead and full screen this so we can see it. I'll go to Split Custom View here, and I'm going to change my navigator down here to the bottom, and I'm going to leave everything on default here, and I just want to show you guys how amazing this plugin is. If you look to the right, this is sharpened. If you look to the left, this is unsharpened. If I start to move this over, you can see this detail just come to life. So it's almost unbelievable to think that it was this dull before the plugin, and now it's this sharp. It's pretty amazing. And look at little details around here, like look at this walkway that we didn't remove yet. Watch the walkway just come to life. And you can see we start to get those edges. It's kind of like a high-pass effect. And what's cool about this is we can tweak it to our liking. By default, it actually looks pretty good. But what I like to do is take the output sharpening strength down a little bit, and I like to bring the focus up. Output sharpening strength, this also has different adaptive sharpening modes for different things. Right now it's set to screen because I'm working on screen. You can set your own profiles for printing so you can get all the texture back in your printing if you want to do large prints. But for me, I just want to have a nice, sharp result. That looks great. Let's go ahead and apply it. Check out this before and after. So this is the fully sharpened image with my high pass filter, which is now a little bit intense, but let's go ahead and take a look at the sharpening layer here. That's wild. It's really, really good. So this is kind of a cool thing that we can do. I don't want the whole image to be razor sharp. I know that sounds funny, but what I want to do is I want the objects close to the foreground, close to the camera, to be extra sharp to kind of lead the eye through. I picked this composition particularly because I liked this hill rolling down and leading the eye into the valley. I like the line of the river moving to the left. I like the waterfall coming down. So it has all of these converging, soft, curvy lines. So we have this line here, the waterfall, and these other lines. So what I'm going to do is just paint this in exactly where I want it, create a black mask on it by holding Option, clicking on the mask, and I'm just going to paint this at 100%. I'm just going to paint it right into the foreground here. So this whole area, some of this texture up here is all going to become sharper, closer to the camera. With my high pass filter, I may also want to roll it down just a little bit. Right now it's at 100%, and I usually use somewhere between 80% and 100% opacity. So I'm just going to take that intensity down just a little bit. Now that I have some sharpening applied, my high pass filter is really only going to be for the background and specifically for this area right here. And that looks pretty good. So the sky is removed. Now I have my extra sharpening. There's my Color Effects Pro layer and all these other layers. So now it's just a time to balance it. And right now, in the studio, you guys might not see this, but I have a lot of lights illuminating me, illuminating the set, illuminating the screen. But if I was really going in to finish this image, I'd want all of these lights off. I'd be pretty much in a dark room, make sure that the curtains are sort of drawn so that I can really focus on these tiny little bits of color. So the darker your environment is, the less reflective your screen is, the better you're going to be able to gauge these little color differences. And we've really put a lot of them in here. So we have all of these different color corrections, all of these different sky layers. So if we do one more thing before we wrap it up here, let's go back to Lightroom. Let's bring in our original exposure, and I'm going to reset the tone here, and I'm going to take that vibrance back down, and let's bring it into Photoshop so we can compare the before and after. So we'll export with previous. I'll just go ahead and use your unique name so I don't overwrite my own file. So I'll copy this image, and I'll go ahead and paste it in, put it right on the bottom here, and we can see what our before image was, which has gone quite a ways from here to here. So you can see now we're starting to get something that looks a little bit more extra real, just more intense, more hyper details, and now we're starting to get these colors back in. At any point, this is where we can start to adjust the final looks of this image here. Here's another trick too. Like I've just added the sharpener here, and I have this other Color Effects Pro layer. And before I did the sharpening, I could change the opacity of this layer. But now, if I want to tweak the opacity of these layers together, I'd either have to change them individually, or here's a nice trick. Like let's say I want this Color Effects Pro, we'll forget about this layer for now. Let's say I only want to use about 80% of this effect to soften the whole thing up just a little bit. But let's say something even less dramatic, or 60%. If I turn the sharpening layer, since I made the sharpening layer out of this effect, it's going to turn that intensity all the way back up. So here's what I can do. I can actually link it to this layer, and by linking it to this layer, it means that it'll take all the properties of opacity and masking from this layer. And to link layers, you can hold Option and you can click, and you're going to see that little icon come up when you're between the layers, and it's going to indent the layer. Now this layer is only going to exist inside of here, so it's going to exist inside of its opacity and everything else. Of course, then I can change this as well, but for all intents and purposes now, this layer with this mask is also going to be 60% because it exists based on the opacity of this layer. So it's a really easy way to control multiple stacks of opacity. So with all that in mind, a nice solid before and after, here's where I'd go make my final tweaks and my final adjustments for the image. And really that's going to be photo filter. If you click on these with the Shift key, you can turn them on and off, and you can see what will happen if you add more of this, more of each one of these things in, you can see what will happen. So that's the red one. Here we have the green one here. You can see I may actually want to add more of this one in the corner here. Get a little bit more of that green luminosity here, which is really nice. Might want to add some more of the luminosity that I had from the first original layer, and then my photo filter, I can actually change the intensity a little bit more back here. Sometimes when I'm working with files, just so you guys know, I'll build it pretty much to this point, and then before I commit it to my final portfolio, I'll close it, leave it closed for a whole day or two, then open it back up so that I can see it with fresh eyes. Because sometimes these micro adjustments are what takes the longest. The only other thing that I could suggest adding to this to take it to the next level, again, we've done all this, we haven't done any dodging and burning. We could probably brighten up this waterfall a little bit, either with dodging, burning, or even just an extra color correction layer. So if I wanted to adjust the brightness of the waterfall a little bit, I could actually do that with a curves layer. Very easy curves layer, just like this. And that would be the intensity of the waterfall. I could black out this curves layer because I didn't do it with the Alt-click option, and then with flow enabled, I can just kind of bring in some more opacity here with the waterfall. With that selected then, I can actually just bring up the intensity of just the waterfall with the paint. So everything can be pushed and pulled at this point. We've learned a bunch of different tools for changing the luminosity. If I do this around the fog, you can see it'll pull that fog up and just change the look of the image. So that all looks pretty good. Again, at this point, it's really that extra few percentage to take it from start to finish, from almost finished at 95% to 100% finished, and the way that you like it. At this point, you can also add your own flair, your own style, and your own balancing. But right now, it's starting to look pretty good. That wraps it up for Lesson 8, Seljalandsfoss, Waterfall in Southern Iceland. Next time I see you guys, we're actually going to be working on a file from New Zealand. So that's very exciting. It's time to move on and change locations from the Northern Hemisphere to the Southern Hemisphere for some new stuff to work on.